Today's presentation is actually a full presentation for the first time. And the purpose is to give you a very important background into the work of Giancarlo DeCarlo. Because DeCarlo is, in fact, the basis for our being there. And I think all too often, he gets passed over, especially in light of all the other great architecture which was happening after World War II in Europe. I did have one professor who was quite knowledgeable about the work of DeCarlo, but in my 7 years of education, that amounted to a single reference at a single lecture. So I figured what's really good is to talk about his work. It's a large reason why we're there, and it's work which is very, very relevant today. In fact, his college campus, where you guys will have class, is considered one of the most important built environments in Europe during that time period, which is post-World War II, before the end of the century. DeCarlo's work in Urbino, all of his work in Urbino, which started in 1958 and went until his death in 2004. His work there is considered to be critically important because there are no other examples of an architect who has focused so much on just one place, which is Urbino. His work is elsewhere in Italy, in Europe, but there are 15 works of architecture that he completed in Urbino, which means you get to see the evolution of thought, the evolution of approach to architecture that is highly unique, and as I said, still very vital today.
What was the time span?
58, 2004. He died in 2004. And he started in 1958. He was commissioned to write, actually not to write this book. This book was produced in 1964. But he was commissioned to study Urbino, to study. And I want to talk a little bit about that here because I think it's very interesting. What you're going to find is you're going to find that our sketching is going to be highly influenced by DeCarlo because DeCarlo designs in section. Those of you who have dealt with me before in studio, it's great to see your face, who have dealt with me before in studio know that I always make the statement that whoever draws the section designs the building. Okay? That's absolutely crucial. He designs in section. There are very few architects who come that close to understanding the interrelationship between the sky and the earth as he does. And I think you'll be very excited to see that in so many buildings. Norman, do you mind turning your light off? Is she taking notes or something?
No.
I'm concerned. She's probably finding errors and omissions. Anyway. Jim, do you want to see if you can hit the light? Yeah, all off. As long as Ruby can see you get the receipt. I'm fine. Yeah, just turn them all off. All the way. Yeah, off. Yeah. Yeah, you guys aren't going to fall asleep. You're too. So there he is. There's the man himself, Carlos.
In the studio.
We're talking about Italy, so the proximity of the Sangiovese is always fairly close. And that's my alternative title. We'll get to that. So what we find out with his work is we find out that he had an approach to design which is inherently analytical. Do you know how you're given a design project, and what do? You do a site analysis. And when you're done the site analysis, now you start the design. He would have a problem with this because that's not how things happen. The idea of analysis followed by synthesis is an invention. It's an invention of a lot of academics who don't fully understand practice. So the way he approaches architecture is through a process he refers to as reading the territory. And this is a complex set of analyses by which he comes to understand the patterns in the environment. And they're both natural and cultural. In fact, he cannot distinguish between the two. Italy, after all, is one of the most intensely cultivated pieces of land anywhere in the world. Okay? It's intensely cultivated. There's nothing natural there, guys, as far as a landscape. Okay? So instead you have this cultural landscape, a landscape of vineyards, a landscape of retaining walls, a landscape of different kinds of planting, a landscape of different field uses, a landscape of the farmhouse, the village, and the city. They're all part of a single whole, which we refer to as the landscape. And his analytical process doesn't stop with trying to produce a report that says analysis. This is a report. We'll get to that. We'll still get to it. I'm not trying to ignore this 1964 book. So, it's an analytical process. Design itself is an analytical process. So what he's doing is he's making a series of proposals which emerge in tandem with the analysis of a place. He starts to consider what it is to intervene into this landscape with new programming, new needs. The needs belong to the present. The landscape is a continuity of the past, the presence of the past. And he tries to find a marriage between these two. So as he produces a proposal, the forces that are inherent in the landscape, and they could be climactic forces, they could be cultural forces, could have to do with patterns of development, patterns of land use. They begin to tug and shape the proposal. And then a new proposal is put forward. Very much an iterative process, something you guys are familiar with since first day of first year, no doubt. And this process keeps going. So the analysis never stops. It is actually part of the design, not separate from the design. And this is the model we're going to be using throughout the semester in Italy. I'm going to take you through a process which parallels the work of De Carlo. I've been studying his work for about 6 years and feel like I'm just now beginning to grasp the intensity of what it is. So, this is it. This is where we start. But let's, a little bit of background, I think, is needed as a frame of reference. First of all, the aftermath of World War II. It's hard for us to picture this. Most of us. Maybe some of you have this experience. I would feel sorry for you if you did. But a landscape which is totally devastated. A landscape which is entirely alien to human habitation. A landscape which has been devastated. The inset, of course, is Florence, and the area to the left and the right of the river that runs through Florence. And this condition is all over Italy. If the Allies didn't bomb it, the Germans did. Okay, when they were leaving, they destroyed all of the bridges along the Arno. They destroyed almost every building within a block of the Arno, except Ponte Vecchio. They refused to. The German colonel said, "There's nothing that's going too far." He said, "Yeah, we have our problems, but I'm not touching this bridge. It's too beautiful." So what we see today is not the historical fabric. It's a new construction. Because after all, the Italians still had to live in these cities. Or did they? In actuality, we find a huge movement of peoples after the war northward in Italy. And similar to the kind of diasporas, which were much larger, that took place in the United States following the Civil War. Is where are the jobs? They're in the north of Italy. They're in Torino with Fiat, right? They're in Milan, which is one of the design capitals of the world. They're in Turin. They're to the north. And so you have this huge exodus of people from the south where there's incredible poverty, where there's a lot of malaria, where there are no jobs. And they moved north. So we have a lot of cities which are basically uninhabited, or at least a city like Urbino, which went from 14 to 20,000 people during the war, all of a sudden dropping to a couple thousand after the war. I think it's 5 or 6. Don't have a number. So what are you going to do with these cities? Well, meanwhile, you've got a government who says, you know what? We need to instill a new civility. You probably heard that one because we have a government right now which is trying very hard not to be civil. However, this period of time, there was actually optimism. There was a sense that if we could instill civility, we could create an entirely new fabric, a healthy fabric for Italy. And where does that civility start? It starts at the university. So there's money which is being made available to the universities throughout Italy. Urbino is one of the largest. Of course, at the time period it wasn't, but it received a new influx of students, or was planning on the new influx of students, which would far outstrip the facilities that were there. And so, what do you do with these new students? What do you do with the university? Traditionally, universities are not like they are in the US, which are on campuses. Very Roman idea, incidentally. But they're actually in cities. You can't take the university out of Bologna because it is Bologna. Right? You can't take the university out of Urbino because it is Urbino. So there was a tremendous sense that the university and the city itself are the same thing. And so, together with the president of the university, Carlo Bo, that's his nickname, Bo, and Giancarlo Di Carlo, they came up with this notion of preserving the city by re-inhabiting the city, by taking new programs which would foster community, and this is crucial. His buildings seek to give a place for community. In the same way that the traditional town gave you a piazza, which brought the community together, he felt that his buildings could also provide those public spaces. And by fostering community, especially among people who are different, you also foster civility. That was the philosophy, and it worked exceedingly well. It led to taking new programs and bringing them to buildings that in any other city would have been torn down. They would have been deemed, too much of a jumble of different time periods, rooms which are too small to accommodate classes, buildings which are too much of a patchwork to warrant investing new dollars in. And he convinced the city of Urbino, along with Carlo Bo, that it was possible. And so he develops an architecture which is an architecture of extremely limited economic resources. And yet an architecture which is very, very rich in providing social spaces at different scales for your interaction. Think about this for a minute. What happened before we had our little cafe here? There was no place in the building for social gathering. We're incredibly limited. Of course, in the University of Urbino, you find dozens and dozens of places in every building where you feel like, hey, I could sit down with some friends and we could talk, or we could play a game. People don't play games anymore. You still play cards? Cards? Pinochle? Bridge? Poker? Don't tell me. Okay. Poker. Cards.
It's fine. This is very discouraging.
Okay.
Let's have a little renewal.
Let's wipe it clean. This is what so many architects were doing. They look at the mess and they buy it up. They buy as much property as they can and they tear it all down and build a new image. This was not what Di Carlo wanted to do. That to me is more discouraging because you lose cultural continuity. You lose identity. So there's a big argument in Italy that happens at this time period. An argument which proposes so many different ways to deal with the past, to deal with depopulation, to deal with the destruction of the city. We have the repristination, as it's now called, of the Arno, where every building you see, besides the bridge in the background, which is Ponte Vecchio, every building that you see is new. It was built in the late 40s and 50s. Doesn't look that way. Because there were a lot of background buildings that were trying to build, not in the style of the Renaissance, but in a manner which they would be confused with Renaissance buildings. Of course, you have Gio Ponti, the great furniture and interior designer, fantastic guy, who pairs with Nervi, the structural engineer, to produce, there's an interior shot, one of the most incredible towers of all time, which is the Pirelli, that's tire, right? They're the ones who make tires. The Pirelli building, which is in Milan, still one of my absolute favorite high-rises ever. At the same time period, in fact, 2 years later, is the BBPR tower, which looks to me a little bit like a throwback to a medieval tower, doesn't it? Major controversy at the time period. How can you be a modernist and make reference to the buildings of the past? And of course, in Venice, you get buildings which are, how do I say it, kind of a mockery of what the late medieval, early Renaissance buildings look like in Venice. So these are all fomenting into a terribly loud and interesting dialogue, which, by the way, was very civil. Of course, because they're seeking a civil society. On top of all that, you end up with this book by Carlo Levi. Carlo Levi, a Jewish writer and doctor, was exiled because he was outspoken against the fascist regime in Rome under Mussolini. And so he was internally exiled to a small town very close to Matera. And in the book, Christ Stopped at Eboli, Eboli is halfway between Matera and Naples, by the way. It's where the trains stopped. You couldn't go further by train at that time. He references the abject poverty in the city of Matera, where people are living like animals in houses carved into the earth, where, interestingly enough, their animals also live. And so what happened is there was a big experiment, and they took the population of the entire region, around 16,000 people, and they took them out of their houses, which, remember, they had pigs and animals living in the house too with them, and moved them into these new villages that they designed. So that all these international sociologists, anthropologists, and architects, and urban planners, and politicians, and probably a few poets thrown in for good luck, came together and had a series of, not competitions, but essentially separate design projects where they tried to understand what was an appropriate architecture for these people who are being displaced. And they were a total failure, abject failure. The big find in all of this, the big find was the Vicinto. Vicinto is a neighborhood which is a public space where several buildings empty out onto, and it serves as a living room for these families who live in dire poverty back into the hills there. So that's the big find. And behind that, in front of that find, building on it, DeCarlo produces this. This was his housing complex, and including an elevation of it right there. Of course, the sheep are still there. A bit of a failure. This is all the latest architecture, all the latest use of materials. These had running water. They didn't have running water in Matera, right? They didn't have no open sewers here. Why is it a failure? Why didn't it work? This plagued, this is today. This is just a few years ago when I was there. This Vicinto is still there, waiting for me to, I love those buildings. I want to perhaps design something like someday. Anyway, so here's the city. It's now one big, bed and breakfast. The rooms are in the earth. And they dig into the earth and they take the rocks and they build the other half of the building out of the earth. Absolutely fascinating. And very perplexing. But it provides DeCarlo with two things. The notion of a social condenser, the neighborhood, Vincito. And number two, the idea that you have to analyze a place. You have to try to understand a place. You have to talk to the people that are going to be living in your buildings. You have to talk to the people who inhabit the city where you're building. You have to study the entire city. Okay? This is critical. This becomes the kernel of reading the territory. So, at the same time period, he puts together a show which is called Spontaneous Architecture. Spontaneous architecture is very much, maybe you've heard of Rudolfsky and the book Architecture Without Architects, which was from a MoMA exhibit in 1958, I think. Don't quote me on that one, maybe a little later. This is 10 years earlier. Interesting enough, Rudolfsky happened to see this show. And it was the first time, we're in the midst of international style, guys. This is the first time that someone picked up a banner and said, we need to look at vernacular architecture. We need to look at the places where people live because there's something there we can learn. They have withstood the test of time. So what he ends up doing is not just an exhibit, but what is claimed to be, years later by historians, to be a viable model for contemporary urbanism. Well, that's not enough. He writes the book. He gets commissioned in '58 to study Urbino, meets Carlo Bo, and produces a report, which he publishes in this book, which is published in '64. It is one of the most thorough reports ever on a single place. It is the model for dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of different studies of other communities. The reason that Italy did not lose all its precious hill towns can be traced back to this book. Otherwise, so many of the hill towns that Germans and English and Americans love to populate in the summer would not be there. They would entirely not be there. Because he suggested we have to find a way to bring new programmatic elements, new economic engines into an existing structure. Am I moving fast enough for you, Norman? This is so exciting. This is, man, you know these guys, Team 10, Team 10. And there's like Le Corbusier peering out behind Team 10. And there's DeCarlo, our great hero. Always not really facing the camera. He's kind of a shy guy, I guess. Okay.
It might help them to tie in what was going on in the United States at this time, also where neighborhoods were being torn down and high-rises put up, particularly
Highways, too.
Public housing, are cutting through neighborhoods for highways and isolating and separating neighborhoods and ignoring existing neighborhoods and how people lived.
Wow. CIA. This was the model for so much of the development in the United States. Pruitt-Igoe, you guys know Pruitt-Igoe, right? CIAM. Following the tenets of none other than the great God himself, Le Corbusier, the Raven. This was actually very crucial, the Athens Charter, which was, in a way, the final important document of the CIAM, which proposed a way of approaching the urban landscape and housing in particular that was to become followed, and you can see examples of that right here, followed across the world, which is you simply eradicate what you don't like and you build new buildings. And you build buildings with plenty of air around them and the latest technology to move people up and down and large parks and all the space you free up. It's like utopia on Earth. And in many ways it was very much a search for utopia. In the midst of all that, they proposed a grid. And I know grids to you think graphic design, so do I. But the CIAM grid down here is critically important because it was used as a tool. If you wanted to present at the Congress, this is, remember, the Congress of International Architecture, right, the CIAM. This grid was how you had to present, which meant what? First of all, I have notes here. I actually have notes and I can read them, perhaps. The grid broke down the presentation into a series of very particular categories: living or dwelling, working, recreation, and circulation. Sounds like zoning, doesn't it? It certainly is. It's the basis of the zoning in America. And it doesn't really work because it creates artificial distances where if you want to go shopping, you go somewhere else. There's no neighborhood anymore. There are a bunch of people living together, but there's no neighborhood. Okay? These categories, the blue, the yellow, the green, the red, which correspond to circulation, blue, recreation, yellow, working, red, and living, dwelling, green. That was how you were supposed to present any projects or proposals, which meant it's also how you're supposed to analyze things, which actually meant it's how you're going to think. It's a grid that shapes your thinking, like any grid.
Let's call it a thought vice.
Yeah, it is, this particular one. So what happens is this. These old guys, great people like Sartre and Le Corbusier, are managing Team 10. Imagine CIAM. And a bunch of young guys come in, they're in their 30s, they're like rock and roll kind of people. And they don't like these old people because the old people are missing something. They're missing something which is quintessential. Number one, they don't let the younger guys get involved all that much. Corbu is always very much about controlling things. And so they make this deal. They say, okay, you guys, you control the next CIAM. You control the next Congress of international architecture. And they become Team 10, as in Team X. By the way, this is the quintessential example of the tenets of the Athens Charter. If you ever get to Brasilia, I heartily recommend it. I'm not saying, I'm downplaying this, but this is still beautiful stuff, and not everything has to be a Pruitt-Igoe. Anyway, so this young group makes a proposal, and their proposal eventually becomes Team 10. Now, Team 10 is very interesting. CIAM is a international congress. It's like a convention that's held every couple years. And a lot of correspondence takes place between the people who are the architects and urban planners in Team 10. In CIAM. But Team 10 makes a different proposal. Their proposal is, we want to meet and discuss things and actually not have a particular
Manifesto?
Yeah, a particular ideology that you have to basically subscribe to, which didn't quite work out that way because of the Smithsons, but that's another story. So it's not a movement. It has no theory involved. I mean, there's people, theoreticians, but there's no single unified theory. There's no manifesto ever produced. This is like the anti-Corbusier. Easy, come on down. The price is right. No fixed membership. Team 10, yes, but in actuality, there were a lot more people involved. It's a discussion circle whose only product is a series of meetings. Aha, there's our hero again, showing up once again. These are the people who are involved in Team 10, including Giancarlo Carlo from Italy. There are a lot more. There was probably some 40 or so people, 50, 60 people who were fairly regular. The Team 10 held meetings almost every year, all the way through 72, I believe, they collapsed. And obviously, that had to do with, I believe, with Bacama's passing. He died tragically. And when he died, he was sort of one of the critical central leaders in there. The other two were Allison and Peter Smithson, who were very dynamic and very outspoken Allison went on to write the primers. The primers is edited by Allison Smithson. She rewrote the history of Team 10, which is a whole other story, one that's well worth considering, but I'm not going to talk about it today. So, back in CIAM, they make this proposal. These are the young firebrands in CIAM number 9, proposing a different grid, which was, I mean, we look at it and say, a grid is a grid, right? It's all about the same. No. House, street, district, city. The most critical thing is the idea of relationship. Where's the architecture, guys? Don't you see actual kids playing and people meeting? I mean, this is radical. That we actually think about human beings and how they experience place and how they engage each other and how they connect each of these scales. The house, the street, the district, the city. These are scales of relationship and association. So here's an example of a grid done with that method. And these are analysis studies of things like circulation, vernacular buildings and how they occupy a site, of course movement patterns and relationship to streets, how one moves through space is very prominent here. So some of them are analytical and some of them are proposals for new projects. Needless to say, the emergence of Team 10 fractured CIAM and CIAM collapsed. Giancarlo De Carlo played an absolute pivotal role. He became very, very outspoken. He started with Team 10 in 1965, so it was their second meeting. Most everyone else met in 63, I believe. I'm sorry, 53 and 55. He went on to be an editor and to write essays which showed up in a large number of publications, including Spazio and Society and the ILAUD publications. He started his own summer school, which was a 3 to 5 week summer school, which would actually get commissions around Europe, and in Siena, Venice, Urbino, and other places throughout Europe. And they would actually make proposals, some of which influenced the course of design in these cities, and towns, and districts. And so he did quite a bit of writing. However, he doesn't say a whole lot about reading the territory. He says a little bit. He says, looking for clues to the genetic code. What a metaphor. What a metaphor. There's a genetic code out there, which means there's a logic which shapes the structure of what we see. It's a logic. It's a pattern of logic. How do we inhabit that site is going to be different than how we inhabit a site 100 miles away, or even 50 miles away, kilometers or so. So this is about the greatest extent of clarity in all of his writing that he offers. Which,
Can you slow down a minute and read some of this?
oh, this is, of course. These clues, I love it, these clues and effects are the ways the buildings are arranged on the terrain in relationship to its contours, to the sun, to light, and to prevailing winds, to waterways. Remember, he's talking about patterns, how buildings are organized. Waterways, roads and footpaths, cultivated fields, areas planted with trees, woodland, other buildings. The kinds of relationships that exist between built-up spaces and open spaces, spaces for activity and spaces for quiet, between homes and public facilities, between places of work and places of leisure. The ways built-up systems, components, parts of buildings, techniques used. I mean, God, this is like a PhD thesis condensed down to like 2 sentences. Pretty powerful stuff. That's all he said. It's the most clarity he brings to this notion of reading the territory. So, we're left with fragments. Therefore, we look to his built work. And luckily, Urbino is filled with his built work. There's the campus over there. There's the city. his analysis of the city provides lessons, not shapes, lessons which he brings to the new campus. And the new campus is constructed over a period of 30 years, or more, actually. So, even looking at the city, we see three most important buildings or complexes. You can't even see them when you're walking through the city. Look at the density of this. The city is just very, very dense. And so, if you inserted a new building into this fabric, you'd certainly see it. Not his. Very, very careful not to have his building stand out from the fabric but become part of it. So, we have a relationship between the residential campus. It's residential, as I mentioned in an earlier presentation. It is not a lot of classrooms here. There are a few classrooms, but not a huge number. And instead, there are certain nodes. I believe I have no, I don't have that image. There are certain social condensers. E at the top represents a monastery that was on the site before. Just below that is a square building, which is a piazza. It's an indoor piazza. And it was envisioned as a building which would have shops in it, coffee house, right? Places to buy books, places to listen to music, right? Places to do your laundry. Alas, the only thing that's in there now is a place to do laundry. They even took out a communal kitchen because the university has lost its vision and it's actually regressed and has been doing as little as possible with this incredible monument to late 20th century thought. So we have these social condensers. Here's an internal social condenser. Over here we have an external social condenser in the form of a piazza. Okay? And this is where we're going to have lecture classes. The first building built at the top of the hill.
And the name of the internal one?
L'Aquilone. L'Aquilone. The kite, because it looks kind of like a box kite. There's our studios, right in there. Boom,
It's a
boom.
bird.
It's a kite. Yeah, L'Aquilone. Okay, so these are the major projects, 15 projects. I'm not going to go into them now. His practice was a search for the relationship between the internal program and the site of the place. And he's constantly looking for the threshold between them. And the thresholds take the form of social condensers. So social condenser is what unites different elements into a single composition. And we'll see examples of it shortly. And they exist at these different scales. Don't those scales look a little bit like what you saw with Team 10 and the end of CIAM? Right? And beginning to think about relationships between the city region. By the way, city region is a term that first appears in this book. Historic central, the centro storico, the historic center of a traditional city or town, is almost the first time it appears in print is in this book. And to this day, that is the #1 political division across Italy as far as looking at these historical towns. All of them have delineated the edge of the historical district. Okay? And we have, again, largely De Carlo to thank for that. I love that. History, memory, tradition, landscape, and habitation. These are the elements that combine together to form this fabric. You guys will grasp it pretty quickly. So, his architecture, you know how we talk about Le Corbusier, we say pilotis, roof garden, free facade, free plan, right? We say the 5 points. Well, we have elements, a vocabulary, if you will, in the work of De Carlo. The social condensers at different scales, remember? Streets and paths, which, by the way, is also a lesson from the city, isn't it? Stairs and ramps, which are elements within the city. Frames and framed views. Walls and openings, which are understood together, and roof terraces. These are the 6 points, if you will, of his architecture, at least the major elements in the vocabulary. And we have a grammar. So wherever you have a language, you have vocabulary and grammar, and syntax, which is getting into another big question that we can talk about later, certainly. So we have elements and we have rules. And the rules are that the building has a dialogue with the site, that there's a dialogue between past and present, that there's a persistence of typical forms. Forms, not shapes. Forms, elements, and gestures. And then there's fundamental spatial types. A cell, which is clustered together to form a unit. Units, which then form vicinati, neighborhoods, or they're held together with the vicinati. Streets and paths, which provide a network of connections. And social condensers at other scales, which provide piazzas and social spaces. And number 5, which no one writes about, almost, is the architectural promenade. So that's sort of my contribution to the study of DeCarlo.
You know what he,
What?
you go back on slide.
Yes.
What, maybe in these,
I like that. Someone is asking a question.
maybe
This
in
is
these
good.
future slides that you're about to show us, the image of the city, what does he mean by persistence of a typical gesture?
Yeah.
That's the one thing.
Okay.
Gesture.
Hold your question. Hold your question. You'll see. This is where it gets exciting. Okay, so, by the way, just because I keep saying lessons from the city, guess who's going to be going out into Urbino to look at the lessons? So I just put the whole list up here. You'll get it later, but there it is. The lessons from the city. Dialogue between past and present. So this is what Urbino looks like. You know, little narrow passageways between buildings, a Renaissance wall system that you can walk on top of portions of it, these beautiful framed views, in this case of the Duomo, social spaces like piazzas, which is right up there next to the Duomo, where the obelisk is there in town, and connections to the countryside. Vital connections beyond the Renaissance walls. There's the countryside. You don't see like massive suburbia, in part because it's very carefully controlled. So that's the city.
Bricks.
Oh, bricks. Yeah, there's a lot of things. Material. Here's what he does. For example, this is just one example. This is Urbino. That's DeCarlo. Do they look the same? No. Are they shaped the same? No. Do they work the same? Yes. Okay? So between his new city, which is actually the campus, and the countryside, you have these little pocket parks, in this case on the roof of L'Aquilone. There's your studios creeping out over the edge there, you can see. But you have this direct relationship that datum of the wall makes a connection to the view of the mountains beyond. That's just one example of many that we could. I don't have time to get into every one of them. But dialogue between building and site. This interconnectedness. You always know where the ground is in his buildings. You always know where it is, whether you're in the city or whether you're on the campus. There's always this direct connection between building and ground. You're constantly aware of the interplay of the two. Beautiful stairs here up in the Colle. This is very close to where you have your lecture. Here's a large dormitory stepping down the hill, which is very interesting in section, I might add. Here's an example. The building up top with the glass skylight is this building. And there's no one entrance. You enter at many different levels, and you enter into the building, and then you can pass out of the building towards the lower. And in between, he's buried, in the middle of the city, he's buried a huge classroom one that can change its configuration based on whether you're teaching one class or you're teaching 6 different classes. Right? And it all fits inside the city. No one sees it. They just don't see it because it doesn't have a face. It doesn't present itself to the city. But he worked so well with the height of the street. You know, he started his design with the section. Gesture, we're waiting for gesture. Mary says, no way, not yet. Gabriel says, yes, come on, it's happening. So this is our gesture, the idea that we read some sort of this is another one Mary does. There's 7 stages, in case you're not Catholic, but I know these things. There's 7 stages of her response to Gabriel's
The
Annunciation. But each one of them has a meaning. We look at it, we read it. We read a gesture. Well, we also read an architectural gesture. Right here in the city of Urbino, you've probably seen this in other cities. We have a corner which is cut, and like a ballard which is added, so the tires don't dig into the building when you go around the corner. It's like a ballard. This also helps you see when you go around the corner. And there's a little cantilever. There's a beautiful stone that sticks out, almost like Mary's hand, maybe not quite as beautiful, which is a beautiful gesture. Well, there it is in the Carlos Book. It allows you to read that direction as an entryway, number one, because it is one of the entryways into the building. It's into a small courtyard, and you enter in through there if you can. Number 2, it actually is a reference to the fact that the original building had to have parts of it removed because they were a jumble. They were unusable. They were shed-like. And the act of removing a historical portion of the building meant that he had to make a graceful gesture which heals that room. And so there's other ways we can read it as well. By the way, it's not supporting anything. That piece of the wall that's sticking out is just a piece of the wall. There's nothing behind it. So it's clearly meant as a gesture. This is my favorite, right? So it's got this building he's putting in the city. It's a completely blank facade, which, by the way, he trims the wall to give you a better view of the sky beyond. But through that open window, it faces a church, which you see through the window. He's making a gesture to the church. So when you're walking down the road and you see that round window, it's like a face of a building which is paying homage to the church across the little piazza. It is so graceful, as opposed to turning your back on the piazza. The building offers a face. It's a gesture to the church. I find it unbelievably beautiful. Here's our social condensers. We talked about them a little bit. There's one scale of social condenser, which, by the way, forms a neighborhood. The neighborhood of L'Aquilone, the neighborhood of La Bella, neighborhood of the Colle, neighborhood of Tridente. These are different neighborhoods. And at other scales, I have examples of social condensers which are inside of these different parts of the campus. So in the middle of a long hallway, we have these little living rooms, which are wonderful. It's a beautiful column. And this is a place where students can gather. And they even have little lockers up here. I don't know what they're for. To lock things in. Here's the inside of L'Aquilone. Beautiful interior space. Of course, an incredible skylight up there. Stunning. Fundamental spatial types. Here's a good one. We have L'Aquilone right next to your studio. And the historical Renaissance, early Renaissance period monastery, the Capuchin monastery. Interestingly enough, you can see them on the plan. And all he's doing is he's taking the square of the monastery as a spatial type, the cloistered garden, and he's bringing it down to L'Aquilone, and he turns it into an interior space as opposed to an outside space, which the courtyard is open to the sky. His courtyard is closed. So he's using a spatial type in a different way. It doesn't look the same, but it works in a similar, very similar fashion. And of course, he's making reference to the piazza. He's making reference to the courtyard as well in doing this. The cell. Here at the Colle, you can see, even in the roof pattern, you can see all of the cells coming together to form these larger social units. And here's
Was that housing?
housing at the Colle. These are student housing,
Yeah.
which form these units, and then they form clusters. So you've got the cell, the unit, the cluster, the neighborhood. Oh, this is fun. God, the street. How would you like a sidewalk like that? Look at the crap you have to walk on in this city. This is wonderful. You get a little tired, you want to sit and talk to a friend, meet a lover, there you are, right there. Fantastic. Beautiful little, I mean, that's all like a piece of sculpture. You're walking in a piece of three-dimensional sculpture. Absolutely fantastic. And of course, the promenade, the architectural promenade. Nowhere is that so clear. It helped that I wrote the paper on it, which was fun. It's fun to discover stuff. It's fun to spend time in his work and feel like I'm still learning. He still has a lot to teach me. So on one side we have Le Corbusier presenting the Promenade Architecturale for the 37 pavilion, CIAM pavilion. And on the other side we have an axonometric of a small little building which is called Casa Romanino, or Ca Romanino. It's a house, C-A, Casa, Ca. It's a house. And you can begin to see, with the addition of the colors which I added, you can begin to see the path as you move from the outside into the building and eventually into the great room by the fireplace. This is the chimney of the fireplace, which is suspended from the roof. And a beautiful study. My wife and I spent a weekend here, and it was just incredible. There it is. There's the great room. And you know, the books are still there. De Carlo used to sit at that, I'm not joking. This is like the client of his, but he was allowed to visit anytime he wanted. And he would sit at that desk and work, which is kind of interesting. I know that because it's a photograph. So I had to sit there. There's our Sangiovese. I knew it would be close. And I'm thinking, there it is. I'm thinking that when we say terroir, right? It's a term you've heard. We've talked about, architecture. We're not talking about food and wine. I think there's a parallel. Terroir is the sum total of the natural environmental forces and the cultural forces of production, which together, over time, have led to very distinctive tastes in wine of a region. Okay, there's different wines. There's wine of fashion. It's like whatever the hell's in fashion. It's in fashion, so I drink it. Big, plush reds are in fashion, so we chug those puppies down. But there's wines of convenience. Wines where it's just the easiest way to do it. You got a problem with an insect, we put on some chemicals. The weather's going to turn cold. We'll just pick the grapes early. Okay? They're wines of convenience. You're just doing what you have to do to get the wine into the bottle. And then there's wines of terroir, wines where you're very consciously trying to maximize the presence of the region in the cultural product, which in this case is wine. But I think it's the same thing for De Carlo's architecture. I think he's doing the same thing. He's trying to understand the region such that it is present in your experience within his buildings. You feel connected to the place. You feel connected to the social discourse which makes up the university. You feel connected to the history of Urbino and the region. We meet this man. There he is. We meet him. We'll meet him. And we'll drink this Sangiovese, and I'm sure we'll enjoy it. Unless you don't drink Sangiovese, in which case.
Is that Marque?
Yeah, that's the
That
market.
particular-
Yeah. We're going to go to that vineyard and have a wine tasting and things. I moved it to the beginning of the semester. That way we can talk about food and wine when Jim is there. Because I think that's important. So, just a few things to close here. This is a theater. The bottom portion of this theater is a spiral ramp, which goes from a piazza called Borgo Mercantile up to a street right in front of the palazzo that you see in the background. And it's a building which was renovated by DiCarlo on the inside. Of course, you can't tell. It fits so beautifully into the fabric of the city. It ends up that the Duke Montefeltro, the Duke during the Renaissance, who was very famous for his work with Alberti and many other Italian artists at the time period and architects, he used to ride his horses up the spiral ramp so he didn't have to go up the main street. I mean, I like that. Anyway, these are pieces of Urbino that you'll come to. The snow, yeah, we'll probably see some snow. But you'll appreciate these qualities of these spaces. There's a gelateria just right here. It opens first? It opens,
Earlier.
yeah, around Valentine's Day, I think, right? Anyways, it's good gelato. I don't think it's excellent. I think you get better gelato down at the Blue Star. South Alamo. Okay? And by the way, you guys have been to South Alamo? Yes?
He's an alumni of the study abroad.
Okay, that's Josh Biffle and his wife, Diletta. Josh met his wife. Well, she wasn't his wife. When he was in Italy on study abroad with Norman. So he owes us, no, I'm joking. But Josh, I think, is probably the best pistachio that I've had. Such a beauty. Sorry, pardon. Anyway, these are students between classes. Think about going across the street or walking down the corridor here. These are students walking between classes in Urbino. Because their classrooms are in the city. And so they're not only, this is great, you guys are not just college students, you're actually urbanites, right? You're actually members of the city itself. There isn't a distinction. The students are the people that live in the city. I think it makes a very different experience for you guys. This is one of DiCarlo's buildings that you see. You can tell because of the red door. But his building is almost invisible. By the way, these lamps, you see the egg-shaped lamp up there? Designed by DiCarlo. Yeah. There's like thousands of them. Imagine if that was my biggest commission, I'd be happy. That's like one of his real small commissions. If I just whipped that out in the weekend, designed a lamp, and boom, there's like 14,000 of them around.
Interesting gesture.
Yeah. Oh, there's our corner again. That's like Mary. She follows us around. She's always there. In times of trouble, Mother Mary comes to me. Yeah, this is her garden. You can't quite tell from here, but there's an axis as you come out through the skylight. There's an axis which connects DiCarlo's building to a church in the horizon, which is where the Montefeltros are buried. I think I have a photograph. There it is. It's right there. Okay? So, I mean, this is pretty good. It's like making this gesture, this connection to the past and to the landscape. You're on a roof, you're in a garden, you've got places to sit, you've got places to be out of the rain. This is what campus should be like, I think. God, look at that concrete work. It's like sensuous. It is, in fact, it is sensuous. It's not like St. Jude's. It is. You want to touch it. Social condensers. Little small areas which are usually filled with students studying for things. I had to put another stereo. I'm sorry. An interpretation of a courtyard. Late 20th century courtyard. A tower which tries very hard, a stair tower, which tries to be invisible. I'll talk more about this. He designs it so you almost don't see it. It's almost not there. An interior street that links a cafe to your right and a theater space to your left. And this is a street that has all these chairs and desks along there. Students are always out there hanging out and studying and talking to each other. The business building with a garden of skylights. Beautiful garden of skylights. Which then is making this gesture of the in-between garden that is present here and on the rampart. The interior of the Dacha. You'll be exhibiting in this building. This is where the end of the year exhibit. This is open all the time. There's a cafe there. They make good coffee. It's got to be good. Best Wi-Fi. Yes, best Wi-Fi. This is inside the Renaissance wall. This is where the Duke kept his horses. It's his stable. I'll show you. Yes, it's still there. Still smells a little bit. Ah, there's my good friend Gabster. And Anna, too. These are rock stars. Jan and Maddie. And Monica Masalani, who was the one who designed that stair tower that you saw that was faceted with DeCarlo. She was the architect in charge with DeCarlo. She is absolutely fantastic. She'll be there working with you guys, too, in the second half of the semester. An art school by DeCarlo, which was originally meant to be 2 to 3 times bigger. And they never quite figured it out, and they chopped it off, and it never grew. You can't get in. They get very upset.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You go there, it's like, what? You can't come in. You're not an artist. You're not an artiste.
Smear paint on it.
Housing. DeCarlo did some housing, inexpensive apartment houses, which are these beautiful things that jut out into the landscape. Right there. The space between. And here's the real good shot. Jimbo. Look at that hat. He is something to learn. He's wearing a rain slicker, isn't he? He's wearing a rain jacket. Huh? Think about it. Think about it. You too will wear one. This is the green that connects the old Capuchin monastery with the Colle building, top of the hill, Colle, where you will have your lectures. You'll have your lectures right in that space to the right. I'm sorry. It just got spring came much earlier. Oh, yeah. Look at the section here. Beautiful section. This is right outside your lecture room almost. One floor down. There's your lecture room. John and Fish showed up. You'll notice that there's light back here. Because not only is there a skylight over the presentation table, which closes, but there's a skylight that goes around the entire theater of students. So you guys can actually see when you take notes. And you can see each other's faces if you have questions. That's thoughtful. It's actually the best room I've ever lectured in my life. Period. It's that incredibly good. And there's the studios from the outside with a library under it. The terrazza, the terrace in front of the studios to your right. Curtis again kept showing up. Just when you don't want him, boom, there he was. Experiencing, he's got a puffy on, silver puffy, probably about 12 to 16 ounces, probably about, knowing Curtis, less than $25. And he's modeling it very well too, I might add, with his nurse. Experiencing another DiCarlo stair.
Demonstrating the rectangle behind him.
Yeah, it's like a proportional rectangle
Right.
too, isn't it? Ah, the interior of the piazza again. I had to sneak another one in, another shot in. I love this space. Looking down the studios.
Tell us the year again that this was built.
The first building was the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and 65, 66. Last building was 1998, I think, the Bella. It was finished in 98. These are nice. It's like on the roof of your studios. There's little gathering spaces to read, I guess, or to flirt. Here's a theater, a little theater space inside one of the buildings.
Which bizarrely they keep knocked off.
Oh, I don't pay much attention to this. You know, it's just a beautiful theater. Imagine someone with a guitar just sitting there. I love it. Maybe Dylan. One of my favorite spaces. Look at the way he pulls the stair away from the wall, away from the beam of the wall. So you can see it like this graceful thing, this jumping down into the space. And the skylight above, the light coming in, the darkness over the side, all these different types of lighting conditions, depending on what you're doing as a student. This is student space, right? If you're busy staring at your textbook or something, you probably want to work where there's more light. So it's just a very interesting kind of environment, which gives you guys, or any student, the freedom to sort of select spaces which you feel are more appropriate to the tasks you're given. These are two additional photographs of the same space. I find it to be stunning and so thoughtful, and yet the vocabulary and the architecture is so restrained. The piazza.
Back up one, please.
Sure.
Imagine yourself at the camera's location on this shot at the right and working out your drawing of a section through that space, height to width, and the concrete ceiling that curves up into the skylight space and the wall that falls down, to being going a little bit beyond and you don't know quite where, how far. That's what you'll be doing.
Good point. Yes, yes. I still do that. I still love it. I learn a lot from these sections. We can argue that the piazza doesn't quite work. It can be argued, but I won't. There's fish again. And he's still modeling that silver puppy. It looks a little bit like San Gimignano, doesn't it? You know, it has the towers and the Renaissance hill panel. Those are stair towers. There's our little neighborhood gathering space, a little sunken living room for the students who live on this corridor. Just, some things are just beautiful. I put them in because they're just beautiful. This is one of my favorite rooms, and it has no purpose. It has absolutely no purpose. It's just places to go to sit, meet people, talk. There was a message board over here. If you had chalk, you could put messages up. There's a beautiful column if you feel like you need a hug. The column. There's different layers. There's a walk just above your head, and then there's another floor above that where you can study if you happen to be one of the students in the dormitory. I mean, it feels good. It feels good. Fabric, guys, fabric. Urban fabric understood at the scale of a building. It must be at least 50 to 60% of his building interior space is public space. Not 10% like this building, or less. Sorry. Frame view. This is where the students were supposed to be, like, planting food. And it didn't work out. Right? So, I mean, think about it. There's no students in there in the summer to tend them. And you're not going to plant food that you're not going to harvest, right? So, it didn't work out. But he was thinking, is it possible to plant food on your roof? Sure, why
It's
not?
a very 60s self-sufficiency type time.
Yeah, they had no money. The thing is, he's doing this with very, very little money. You don't need expensive material. You don't need flashy, zoomy architecture. You just need architecture which cares about social engagement and cares about its relationship to the site. The terroir. Like a hill town. It's like a contemporary hill town. With a theater on the roof of L'Aquilone. An interior street marked by skylights. Back to that image, which I love. That's the landscape outside your studio. Finito. Okay. Giancarlo does this to me. Wait till I'm there and I start like dancing. If Curtis was there, we'd do our umbrella dance together. We practiced in Florence one year. We did the umbrella dance. So anyway, that's where we are. That's what we're doing. That's what we're studying. Of course, we're looking at old buildings, but we're not looking at them because they're historical. We're looking at them because there's lessons we can learn. Right? We're going into old churches, not because they happen to be great storehouses of wonderful works of art, and because I'm trying to convert you to Catholicism, which I'm not. Although, it's a thought. No, it can't be. I can't do any conversion. We're doing it because there's lessons to learn. Because as we engage these traditional communities, as we walk through their public spaces, as we study their art, it has a voice, and it still speaks to us in ways that we can understand. You want to learn about color? Then look at the work of the Renaissance masters. You want to learn about scale and proportion? Then look at the work of Brunelleschi. You want to learn about the city and how the city operates and functions? Then walk through Milan during the design week, if you can. You may not be distracted by beautiful design or by this wine that they hand out in the shops that try to get you to be seduced by the beautiful design. Or the beautiful people. There's at least a dozen. Anyway, all right. Any questions? Any comments? This is it. Easy to miss the beginning. All the good stuff is in the beginning. We're skipping. Okay. So when I started the study abroad program and started teaching in Urbino, I really didn't understand the Carlo. And the first year I go there, it just knocks me off my feet. I'm just amazed. Why don't we study his work more? Is it because he's not some sort of great master with a huge ego like Le Corbusier? Is it because that he's not postmodern, as so many architects were at his time period, who tried to put little gabley things on top of things with big columns? Is it because he never wrote a book like Charles Jenks or Frampton? I mean, why? It's hard to tell. Is it because that his buildings have not been taken care of, and so many of them haven't been? Because the university doesn't realize what they have. They don't realize that this kind of place exists nowhere else in the world. But the laboratory that he studied is also now expanded to being his buildings that we can study. And you can begin to understand the nature of practice practice that you guys will be involved in someday. A practice that'll mean something to you in proportion to your capacity to give something back to place, to give something back to the people that inhabit the buildings. A little bit of joy, and hopefully a couple glasses of Sangiovese. Ciao, ciao.